The waters of Inchon Harbor churned black under the moonless sky of September 15, 1950. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray stood on the deck of the USS Mount McKinley, watching the silhouettes of American warships assemble in the distance. His face remained stoic, but his stomach knotted with tension. In just hours, his Marines would attempt what many military experts had deemed impossible: an amphibious landing at a port with some of the most treacherous tides in all of Asia. 30 feet, Murray muttered, recalling the extreme difference between high and low tide. 30 damn feet of mud and seawall to overcome. 3 months earlier, no one could have predicted the desperate gamble that would become Operation Chromite. When North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel on June 25th, they had overwhelmed the unprepared South Korean army and their American allies. Seoul fell in just 3 days. By August, the combined UN forces had been pushed into a tiny defensive perimeter around the port city of Pusan, clinging to the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula. General Walton Walker's 8th Army was trapped, exhausted, and dangerously low on supplies. The North Korean People's Army seemed on the verge of pushing the UN forces into the sea, completing their conquest of the entire peninsula. Their commander, Kim Il-sung, already celebrated victory in propaganda broadcasts to his people. The American imperialists and their puppets will soon be driven from our homeland forever, North Korean radio triumphantly announced on September 10th. The final liberation of our country is at hand. This context drawn from David Halberstam's The Coldest Winter, America and the Korean War, which details the precarious position of UN forces in the summer of 1950. But behind the scenes, a bold counteroffensive was taking shape, one that would catch the North Koreans completely off guard. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of UN forces in Korea, had been advocating for an amphibious landing far behind enemy lines at the western port of Inchon, near Seoul. The audacity of the plan worried the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. We drew up a list of every natural and geographic handicap, and Inchon had them all, Admiral Forrest Sherman would later recall. The objections were numerous and substantial. Inchon's extreme tidal variations meant landing craft could only approach shore during brief windows of high tide. Mudflats extending for miles during low tide would leave troops and vehicles stranded and vulnerable. 2 fortified islands guarded the narrow channel approach. The seawalls stood nearly 12 feet high in places, requiring specialized landing equipment. Intelligence on enemy positions was minimal at best. When challenged about these obstacles during planning sessions, MacArthur had simply risen from his chair, his voice resonating with conviction. The very arguments you have made as to the impracticabilities involved will tend to ensure for me the element of surprise, for the enemy commander will reason that no one would be so brash as to make such an attempt. Now, as the invasion force gathered offshore, Lieutenant Colonel Murray and his 1st Marine Regiment prepared to discover whether MacArthur's gamble would pay off or result in catastrophe. The intelligence report suggested approximately 2,000 second-rate North Korean troops defended Inchon, but intelligence had been wrong before. As dawn approached, Murray moved among his men, noting their determined faces. These weren't green recruits, but hardened veterans, many having fought in the Pacific during World War II. They understood the stakes. If successful, this landing would sever North Korean supply lines, relieve pressure on the Pusan perimeter, and potentially change the entire course of the war. The assault would begin not on the mainland, but with the capture of Wolmi-do, a small island connected to Inchon by a causeway. Securing it was essential before the main landing could proceed during the evening high tide. Murray checked his watch. Less than an hour remained before the preliminary naval bombardment would begin. Above, stars were fading as the first hints of gray touched the eastern sky. The massive invasion force, over 70,000 men and nearly 200 ships, remained hidden in darkness, a coiled spring about to be released. At exactly 5:45 on the morning of September 15th, the silence shattered as naval guns from Task Force 77 opened fire on Wolmi-do Island. The thunderous barrage illuminated the dawn sky, painting apocalyptic shadows across the water. Each flash revealed more of Inchon's distinctive harbor, with its narrow channels and treacherous approaches. Commander Michael J. Murphy of the USS Mansfield, watched from the bridge as his destroyer joined the bombardment. For nearly an hour, shells rained down on the small island, targeting known North Korean positions, bunkers, and artillery emplacements. The island itself seemed to shudder under the impact. Like watching an earthquake, Murphy would later write in his report. The entire landmass appeared to rise and fall with each detonation. As documented in the Naval Historical Center's The Sea War in Korea, the preliminary bombardment involved some of the heaviest concentrated naval fire of the post-World War II era. While shells pounded Wolmi-do, Lieutenant Colonel Robert D. Taplett's 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines prepared for the initial assault. Their landing craft circled in the channel, waiting for the signal to approach the beaches designated as Green Beach. Unlike traditional amphibious landings where troops would rush directly from sea to shore, the Marines faced the additional challenge of scaling Inchon seawalls after landing. At 6:30 precisely, the bombardment paused. In that sudden silence, the only sounds were the churning engines of landing craft moving toward Wolmi-do. North Korean defenders, those who had survived the bombing, emerged from their bunkers to man what remained of their defensive positions. The first wave of Marines hit Green Beach at 6:33. As they leapt from their landing craft, enemy machine guns opened fire from several intact bunkers. The staccato bursting of bullets across the water's surface created miniature geysers around the advancing Marines. Captain Robert A. McMullen led his company up the beach, diving for cover behind a low stone wall. "Move inland! Push through!" he shouted above the renewed naval gunfire, now targeting positions further up the slope. The Marines responded with disciplined efficiency, establishing a perimeter and beginning their advance toward the island's central ridge. By 7:50, the Marines had secured the critical high ground on Wolmi-do. North Korean resistance proved less formidable than feared. Many defenders had been killed in the preliminary bombardment, while others fled across the causeway toward Inchon proper. By 9:30, Wolmi-do was declared secure, with the American flag raised over its highest point. The operation had cost just 17 Marine casualties, far fewer than planners had feared. But this was only the first phase. The main landing at Inchon itself would not begin until evening high tide, just after 5 o'clock. Throughout the day, naval vessels continued to shell Inchon's defenses. Carrier-based aircraft from the USS Philippine Sea and USS Valley Forge conducted bombing runs against enemy positions, roads, and any visible troop concentrations. The smoke from these bombardments created a dark pall over the harbor, obscuring the city itself. Inside Inchon, confusion reigned among North Korean commanders. They had dismissed earlier intelligence about a potential landing as either disinformation or a minor diversionary attack. The North Korean High Command remained convinced that the Americans lacked both the capability and will to attempt such a risky operation. Most of their best troops and equipment remained focused on the Pusan perimeter, nearly 200 miles away. Colonel Chi Byong-dok, commanding North Korean forces in Inchon, desperately requested reinforcements as the day progressed. His messages became increasingly urgent as naval bombardment intensified and aerial reconnaissance reported massive naval formations offshore. But his superiors, still skeptical about the scale of the attack, allocated only minimal additional forces. "We are facing not a raid but a major invasion," Chi reported at 3 in the afternoon. "Request immediate reinforcement and air support." By then, it was already too late. The North Korean Air Force, largely destroyed in earlier fighting, could offer no meaningful resistance, and ground reinforcements, even if approved, would take days to reach Inchon. As afternoon waned, General MacArthur observed preparations from the USS Mount McKinley. Despite his outward confidence, those close to him noted his tense posture and uncharacteristic silence. The coming hours would either validate his strategic vision or result in one of the costliest military blunders in American history. At 5:29 in the evening, as high tide reached its peak, the second phase of Operation Chromite began. The main landing force approached Red Beach and Blue Beach, facing the seawalls of Inchon proper. The fate of the Korean War hung in the balance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Inchon Harbor as the second wave of the amphibious assault commenced. Unlike the morning's attack on Wolmi-do, this phase targeted the mainland itself, specifically the areas designated Red Beach in the Industrial Center and Blue Beach in the main harbor district. Between these two primary landing zones stood a series of imposing seawalls, some reaching heights of nearly 12 feet. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond L. Murray's 1st Marines approached Red Beach at 5:33 in the evening. As they're landing, craft neared the seawalls, the men could hear the crack of small arms fire from North Korean defenders who had survived the day's bombardment. Rocket and artillery fire from accompanying vessels attempted to suppress these positions, but the defenders held their ground. "This is where we find out if those scaling ladders work," Murray said grimly to his executive officer as their vessel approached the wall. The landing craft ground against concrete as coxswains maneuvered as close as possible to the seawalls. Marines scrambled to deploy their aluminum ladders against the vertical barriers. The first men to reach the top made tempting targets for North Korean gunners. Private First Class Eugene Matthews was among the first to attempt the climb at Red Beach. "The ladder swayed under our weight," he would later recall in an interview with the Marine Corps Historical Division. "3 of us started up. The man above me took a bullet through the shoulder and fell back. I kept climbing, not looking down, just focused on reaching the top and finding cover." According to accounts preserved in the U.S. Marines in Korea 1950-1953 official history, the seawall assault represented one of the most technically challenging amphibious operations since the Pacific Island campaigns of World War II. At Blue Beach, Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller's 5th Marines encountered similar obstacles, but benefited from the presence of a partially destroyed dock that allowed some troops to bypass the seawalls entirely. Puller, already legendary among Marines for his leadership in World War II, personally directed the landing from aboard the USS Wontuck. "Keep moving inland," Puller bellowed through a megaphone. "Establish the beachhead and push forward. Don't bunch up at the wall." By 6:30, both landing zones had been secured despite fierce resistance. Marine casualties were significant, but not catastrophic. Approximately 175 men killed or wounded in the initial assault. The carefully planned naval gunfire support had successfully suppressed many of the North Korean defensive positions. As night fell over Inchon, the Marines pushed methodically into the city, securing block after block. Street fighting intensified, as scattered North Korean units attempted to organize a coherent defense. But their command structure, already damaged by the bombardment, began to collapse under the pressure of the American advance. Colonel Chi Byong-dok tried desperately to coordinate a counterattack, gathering whatever forces he could muster near the city center. With communications disrupted, he dispatched runners to outlying units with orders to converge and establish defensive positions along the main avenues leading from the harbor. Meanwhile, on the USS Mount McKinley, General MacArthur received preliminary reports of the landing's success. His gamble appeared to be paying off. The element of surprise had been achieved, and the initial beachhead established at a cost far below worst-case estimates. "Send in the second wave immediately," MacArthur ordered. "We must exploit this advantage while the enemy remains disorganized." Throughout the night, more troops and equipment poured ashore. Combat engineers worked frantically to create paths up the seawalls for vehicles and artillery. By midnight, nearly 70% of the planned first-day force had landed, and the perimeter extended nearly a mile inland in some sectors. North Korean prisoners, many looking shocked and bewildered, began to arrive at collection points near the beaches. Intelligence officers conducted immediate interrogations, learning that many units had been caught completely unprepared. Several captured officers admitted they had dismissed reports of an impending landing as impossible due to the harbor's natural obstacles. One captured North Korean major told interrogators, "We were told no naval force could navigate the channels of Inchon, and no commander would be foolish enough to attempt it. When your shells began falling this morning, many thought it was merely a raid or diversion." By dawn on September 16th, the success of the Inchon landing was undeniable. Marine and Army units had secured a substantial beachhead and were preparing to advance toward Seoul, just 20 miles away. The North Korean supply lines to their forces in the south had been effectively severed. In Pyongyang, the North Korean High Command received fragmented reports of the disaster unfolding. At Inchon, Kim Il-sung demanded explanations and ordered immediate counterattacks, but the strategic initiative had already shifted decisively. The tide of war, much like the extreme tides of Inchon Harbor, had turned dramatically in just 24 hours. Dawn, on September 16th, revealed the full extent of the previous day's success. American flags flew over key positions throughout Inchon, as Marines consolidated their gains and prepared for the advance toward Seoul. Landing operations continued unabated, with tanks, artillery, and supply vehicles now moving ashore in significant numbers. Major General Oliver P. Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, established his headquarters in what had been Inchon's customs house. Military police directed an ever-increasing flow of traffic from the beachheads, while combat engineers, cleared roadblocks and repaired damaged bridges. "We've achieved complete tactical surprise," Smith reported to MacArthur, who had come ashore that morning to observe firsthand. "North Korean resistance is disorganized and piecemeal. We're ready to begin the drive toward Kimpo Airfield and Seoul." MacArthur, standing at a vantage point overlooking the harbor, nodded with satisfaction. "The operation is proceeding according to plan," he told assembled war correspondents. "The strategic opportunities created by this landing will soon become apparent to the world." As noted in MacArthur's own memoir, Reminiscences, the general considered Inchon the most radical military operation I ever planned, and would later describe it as his greatest military achievement. The advance toward Seoul began in earnest on September 17th. The 5th Marines pushed northeast toward Kimpo Airfield, South Korea's largest airbase, while the 1st Marines drove east along the Inchon-Seoul Highway. The immediate objective was to recapture these strategic locations and sever North Korean supply lines before enemy commanders could organize an effective response. Colonel Kim Chong-oh, commanding the North Korean 3rd Regiment, attempted to establish blocking positions along the Seoul Highway with his remaining forces. With barely 800 effectives and limited heavy weapons, he faced an impossible task against the advancing Marines supported by tanks, artillery, and overwhelming air power. "Hold until reinforcements arrive," came the orders from Pyongyang, but both Kim and his superiors knew this was merely hollow encouragement. Any significant reinforcements were days away at best, committed to the Pusan perimeter or scattered by continuous American air attacks. By nightfall on September 17th, Marine reconnaissance units had reached the outskirts of Kimpo Airfield. The following morning, Lieutenant Colonel Robert D. Taplett's 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines launched a coordinated attack on the PUF airfield's defenses. Despite determined resistance from approximately 500 North Korean troops, the Marines secured the facility by mid-afternoon. Captain William F. Harris radioed Division Headquarters. "Kimpo Airfield secured at 1600 hours. Runway damaged but repairable. Requesting engineering support and air controllers." Within 24 hours, Air Force personnel arrived to assess the damage. By September 20th, transport aircraft were landing at Kimpo, delivering critical supplies and evacuating wounded. The capture of this strategic airfield dramatically improved the logistical situation for advancing UN forces. Meanwhile, the 1st Marines encountered stiffer resistance as they approached Seoul's western defenses. North Korean commanders, now fully aware of the threat posed by the Inchon landing, began diverting whatever forces they could spare from the Pusan front. Elements of the North Korean 9th and 10th Divisions received urgent orders to establish defensive positions around the capital. On September 20th, 3 North Korean T-34 tanks supported by approximately 400 infantry attempted to ambush a Marine column near Sosa, a western suburb of Seoul. The resulting 3-hour battle ended with all 3 tanks destroyed and the North Korean infantry scattered after suffering heavy casualties. Staff Sergeant Lee Davidson of the 1st Marines described the engagement. "They tried to hit our flank where they thought we were vulnerable, but our air support spotted their movement, and we were ready. Our own tanks and artillery caught them in open ground. It wasn't really a fight after the first 15 minutes. More like a slaughter." As advancing Marines captured documents and interrogated prisoners, a clearer picture emerged of the strategic impact of Operation Chromite. North Korean commanders faced an impossible dilemma: maintain pressure on the Pusan perimeter, or redirect forces to counter the Inchon landing. Either choice meant accepting significant risk. By September 22nd, just 1 week after the initial landing, UN forces had reached Seoul's western outskirts. The North Korean High Command, recognizing the strategic disaster unfolding, ordered units still fighting in the south to begin withdrawing northward before their retreat was completely cut off. In the Pusan perimeter, General Walton Walker's 8th Army detected this shift and launched its own breakout offensive on September 16th. North Korean forces, already weakened and now concerned about their supply lines, began a disorganized withdrawal. The audacious gamble that many military experts had criticized was paying dividends beyond even MacArthur's optimistic predictions. The question was no longer whether Seoul would be recaptured, but how quickly, and at what cost. Seoul, a city of nearly 1 million residents, presented a far more formidable challenge than Inchon or the approach routes. By September 22nd, North Korean defenders had transformed South Korea's capital into a fortress. Under the direction of General Choi Yong-kun, approximately 20,000 troops established interlocking defensive positions throughout the city. Major General Edward Almond, commanding X-Corps, coordinated the multi-pronged assault on Seoul. The 1st Marine Division would attack from the northwest and west, while elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division and South Korean units would approach from the south and northeast. Seoul will be heavily defended, Almond warned his commanders during a planning session on September 22nd. The North Koreans understand its symbolic and strategic importance. They'll fight house to house if necessary. The urban combat that followed proved him correct. Beginning on September 25th, Marines encountered fierce resistance as they pushed into the city. North Korean defenders had fortified key intersections, government buildings, and the high ground along the northern bank of the Han River. Snipers occupied tall buildings, while machine gun nests covered major avenues of approach. Captain Robert H. Barrow's Company A, 1st Marines encountered particularly determined resistance near Seoul's central railway station. "They've turned the entire station into a bunker," Barrow reported after his initial assault was repulsed. "Request air support and additional tank elements." According to the official U.S. Marine Corps history, the Inchon Seoul operation, the urban fighting in Seoul represented some of the most difficult combat of the early Korean War, comparable to the Pacific Island fighting of World War II in its intensity. The battle devolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Marine flame. Tanks proved essential in dislodging North Korean troops from fortified positions. Buildings changed hands multiple times as attacks and counterattacks swept through neighborhoods. Civilians caught in the crossfire suffered tremendously, with thousands seeking shelter in basements or fleeing the city entirely. At the Seoul National University campus, approximately 800 North Korean troops launched a desperate counterattack against elements of the 5th Marines on September 26th. The 4-hour battle ended only after Marine aircraft dropped napalm on the attacking force, turning the university's central plaza into an inferno. Lieutenant Colonel Harold S. Royce described the scene. "The enemy came at us in human waves, showing complete disregard for casualties. Our lines bent but never broke. By the time air support arrived, we were nearly out of ammunition." Throughout the battle, the Han River bridges remained critical objectives. Though North Korean engineers had destroyed the main spans during their initial invasion months earlier, the remaining structures still held strategic importance. Control of these crossing points would allow UN forces to pursue retreating North Korean units north of the river. On September 27th, elements of the 7th Infantry Division secured the southern banks of the Han River, effectively surrounding the city. With escape routes diminishing, some North Korean units attempted to break out northward, while others continued fighting with increasing desperation. Inside the besieged city, General Choi Yong-kun recognized the inevitable outcome, but ordered his remaining forces to delay the American advance for as long as possible. Each day of fighting in Seoul was a day that other North Korean units could use to establish new defensive lines further north. By September 28th, American and South Korean forces controlled approximately 80% of the city. Pockets of resistance remained, particularly around government buildings in the Uikao Central District and along the northern riverbank. But organized North Korean resistance was collapsing. At the former Capitol building, a platoon of Marines raised an American flag on the afternoon of September 28th, a moment captured by combat photographers and soon broadcast around the world. Though fighting continued in parts of the city, General MacArthur declared Seoul officially liberated. On September 29th, in a carefully choreographed ceremony, MacArthur formally returned control of the capital to South Korean President Syngman Rhee. Standing amid the ruins of the government house, MacArthur proclaimed, "Mr. President, by the grace of a merciful providence, our forces fighting under the standard of that greatest hope and inspiration of mankind, the United Nations, have liberated this ancient capital city of Korea." The ceremony took place even as sporadic gunfire could be heard in distant neighborhoods, where Marine and Army units continued clearing operations. The liberation of Seoul had come at a high cost, nearly 1,500 American casualties and an estimated 17,000 Korean civilians killed or wounded during the urban fighting. But the strategic objective had been achieved. Just 2 weeks after the Inchon landing, Seoul had been recaptured, and the North Korean military machine was in full retreat. By early October 1950, the strategic landscape of the Korean War had transformed completely. What had begun as a desperate defensive action at Pusan had, through the audacity of the Inchon landing, evolved into a full-scale rout of North Korean forces. The lightning success of Operation Chromite would enter military textbooks as one of history's most successful amphibious operations. North of Seoul, the remnants of the once formidable North Korean People's Army fled toward the 38th parallel. Their carefully planned invasion, which had nearly succeeded in unifying the Korean peninsula under communist rule, now collapsed into a disorganized retreat. Equipment was abandoned, documents destroyed, and units scattered as American aircraft relentlessly attacked the exposed columns. General Matthew B. Ridgway, visiting Korea in early October to assess the situation, reported back to the Joint Chiefs, "The enemy's offensive capability has been destroyed south of the 38th parallel. His losses in men and materiel have been catastrophic. We are witnessing, not a retreat, but a complete disintegration of major combat formations." As documented in military historian T.R. Fehrenbach's This Kind of War, the strategic reversal following Inchon represented one of the most dramatic turnarounds in modern military history. In Washington, the stunning success created both opportunity and complication. The original UN mandate had been simply to repel the North Korean invasion and restore the border at the 38th parallel. With that objective now within reach, President Harry Truman and his advisors faced a momentous decision: halt at the pre-war boundary or authorize an advance into North Korea itself. On September 27th, even as fighting continued in Seoul, the Joint Chiefs of Staff sent MacArthur new orders. "Your military objective is the destruction of the North Korean armed forces. In attaining this objective, you are authorized to conduct military operations north of the 38th parallel." MacArthur, who had advocated for just such an expansion of the conflict, wasted no time. By October 1st, South Korean units had already crossed the parallel, with American forces following soon after. The war's character changed fundamentally, from a defensive action against aggression to an offensive campaign that potentially threatened the existence of North Korea itself. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung faced the collapse of his military forces and the prospect of American troops advancing toward his capital. He urgently requested assistance from his communist allies. On October 2nd, Kim sent a desperate appeal to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. "I ask that the Soviet Union provide direct military assistance in the current crisis." Stalin, unwilling to risk direct confrontation with America, declined to intervene directly. Instead, he turned to China, suggesting that Chairman Mao Zedong's new communist government might need to enter the conflict to prevent the complete destruction of North Korea. On October 7th, as UN forces pushed deeper into North Korea, Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai summoned the Indian ambassador to an urgent midnight meeting. Zhou delivered a stark warning: if American troops cross the 38th parallel, China will be forced to intervene. This warning, relayed to Washington and the UN, was largely dismissed as diplomatic bluffing. General MacArthur assured President Truman that China would not risk war with the United States. This fatal miscalculation would have profound consequences in the months ahead. By mid-October, UN forces had captured Pyongyang and pushed toward the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. The spectacular success that had begun at Inchon now appeared to be leading to total victory and Korean unification under a Western-aligned government. On October 19th, nearly 200,000 Chinese volunteer forces began crossing the Yalu River into North Korea under cover of darkness. The Korean War was about to enter an entirely new phase, one that would ultimately lead to a bloody stalemate rather than the decisive victory that had seemed imminent after Inchon. For the Americans who had participated in the Inchon landing and subsequent liberation of Seoul, the operation remained a highlight of their military careers. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray, whose first Marines had been among the first to scale Inchon's seawalls, would later reflect, "In terms of conception, planning, and execution against overwhelming natural obstacles, Inchon stands as a masterpiece of amphibious warfare." The daring landing had indeed changed the course of the war, transforming near defeat into a dramatic reversal of fortune. Though the conflict would continue for nearly 3 more years before ending in stalemate, the strategic surprise achieved at Inchon demonstrated the decisive impact that boldness and calculated risk could have in warfare. General Douglas MacArthur, whose insistence on the Inchon plan had overcome considerable skepticism, received acclaim for his strategic vision. In his memoirs, he would describe the operation succinctly. "The Inchon landing is probably the only operation in our country's history where I overruled all my commanders and proceeded entirely on my own responsibility." For North Korea, the AE lessons were equally profound, but far more painful. Their initial success had bred a dangerous overconfidence. By concentrating forces on the Pusan perimeter and leaving minimal defenses elsewhere, they had created a vulnerability that MacArthur exploited perfectly. The tactical surprise achieved at Inchon shattered not only North Korean military positions, but also their strategic assumptions about American capabilities and resolve. In military academies worldwide, Operation Chromite continues to be studied as a classic example of how asymmetric thinking and calculated risk can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The extreme tides that North Korean commanders believed would protect Inchon, instead, became the very factor that ensured tactical surprise. The legacy of Inchon extends beyond its immediate military impact. It demonstrated that even in the nuclear age, conventional operations executed with imagination and precision could achieve decisive results. For a brief, shining moment in September 1950, the tactical brilliance displayed at Inchon offered hope that the Korean conflict might reach a swift and favorable conclusion, a hope that would ultimately be deferred by the larger geopolitical forces that transformed a regional conflict into one of the first major confrontations of the Cold War era.